I think we're going to get going. My name's Craig Kennedy. I think this is my 6th Riga conference. It's really great to be here. And our topic for this last session of the morning is Europe in the shadow of U.S. strategic debate. Are we, meaning Europe, losing to greater Middle East, Asia, and Pacific? In some ways, it's an extension of the last panel. What we really hope to do is get in somewhat deeper into what is the future of U.S.-European cooperation in this very different environment that we have now. We have a really good panel, very distinguished panel. We're going to start with Julie Smith, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President of the United States, formerly high official at the Pentagon in charge of European and NATO relations, and before that, a very distinguished analyst and scholar. Simone Serfaty, who has been to at least as many of these as I have, a well-known writer, observer on U.S.-European relations for many years at CSIS. Kurt Volker, longtime diplomat, ambassador to NATO, now the executive director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And then finally, Ambassador Hans-Friedrich von Plotz, German ambassador to the UK, Russia, NATO, I'm sure a few other places that I missed, long career in the German Foreign Service. Let me just start by setting the stage a little bit. I was telling someone in the last 6 months, this is my 20th discussion that I've done on the pivot. And I have to say, I'm always amazed at how concerned Europeans are, and I'm sure we'll hear reasons why today. It's especially interesting because American rebalancing to the Pacific isn't new. In 1890, we built a huge fleet to take into the Pacific. At the time, a number of European powers actually were very grateful that we were doing that and not building an Atlantic fleet that somehow could meddle in European affairs. In 1952, at the end of the Korea War, there was again a great outpouring of concern in Europe that we weren't focused enough on the European challenges. We were spending too much time in Asia. In 1972, when the German Marshall Fund was created, Willy Brandt, in fact, said that one of the reasons was his concern that the best and most talented analysts in the United States were focused on China, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and weren't paying attention to Europe. You can go on and on and on. In 1995, when I first started this job, Europeans were convinced that Bill Clinton didn't care about Europe and was taking the United States elsewhere. By 2000, he could have become the president of the European Commission without much of a push. The fact is, Asia is a magnet. Last year in our Transatlantic Trends Survey, more Americans thought that Asia was important than they thought Europe to our future. And especially when you looked at younger people under the age of 40, it was overwhelmingly attracted to Asia. This year, it changed, and in fact, Europe is back up on top. I'm not allowed to speculate as to why, since Constance is here, but I have to say you are on the headlines of the United States all the time, and that may remind us that Europe is there. So here's what I'd like to do. We're going to start out with Julie. There's two real questions I think be worth looking into. One is, what really is the future of U.S.-European cooperation? Is it largely going to just be reduced to an economic relationship? We may even bring Julian in to do a cameo at some point and throw one or two more grenades to kind of spark a debate. Or is there really something robust, a robust future for this relationship? And then, should the U.S. be doing more with Europe on Asia and other global challenges? The fact is, as Kurt Volker reminded me, that there's long been a U.S.-European consultation on China and Asia. There's definitely been attempts to bring European and American thinking on Asia and other parts of the world closer together. It's not always clear how much that has produced, and maybe we'll get into it. And it's also at a time when, at least in the United States, you increasingly hear people paying attention to what one analyst at a think tank in town calls the global swing states: Indonesia, India, Turkey, Brazil, these new emerging powers that may hold some kind of significant value as allies in the future. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Great. Well, thanks, Craig. It's a pleasure to be here with so many friends and colleagues, former colleagues like Craig and Simone and Sandy Vershbow, and the list goes on and on. The last time I was in Riga, I'm embarrassed to admit, was actually in 1996. So as I walk around every corner, my jaw is dropping with the transformation of the city. I've been studying Latvia's transformation from afar, from a policy perspective, for a long time, but to see the architectural change in the city is breathtaking. So I wanted to say just a few words about the ever-famous rebalancing. I, too, have attended a handful of conferences on this, and discussions in recent months, and there are a lot of misperceptions out there. Some view it as a zero-sum game, somehow where Europe loses and Asia wins. Some believe that it's simply rhetorical with no real policy implementation behind it, which is certainly not the case. Some think it's a China policy, that it has no regional aspect. And lastly, there's this impression that it's tied strictly to defense and the new defense strategy that was rolled out earlier this year. So let me say just a few words about it, and then, of course, we want to open it up to discussion after we hear from the other panelists. So when the president and the vice president came into office in 2009, they quickly reached the conclusion that the United States was underinvested in Asia, and as a result, kind of sent notice to the team, to the cabinet officials and other folks working in the foreign policy arena, that we would need to renew and kind of revitalize our policies and efforts and resource allocation towards Asia. You'll remember Secretary Clinton's first trip was not to Europe, it was to Asia, and not just to China, but to Southeast Asia as well. And so off we went with kind of this whole-of-government approach, we like to call it, that included a couple of different components. There was a heavy emphasis on our old partners in Asia, our kind of traditional allies of Australia, Japan, Korea, and there was a heavy emphasis and diplomatic push towards some new emerging economies in Asia, countries like Vietnam, Burma, Brunei. Secretary Clinton was just in the Pacific Islands, by the way, first time in a long time that we've had an official at that level visit the Pacific Islands. We also wanted to focus on the multilateral architecture that's out there, that's very nascent, very embryonic, whether you're looking at the East Asia Summit, which the president attended for the first time last November, or the ASEAN Regional Forum, or APAC, which we've worked to revitalize. And there's been an economic component as well, where we focused heavily on trade negotiations, enhancing ties with countries that wanted to work with us in the area of economics and trade through the Trans-Pacific Partnership or through the revitalized APEC Forum. Now, all that said, despite the long-term emphasis on Asia that has been underway with the administration, I think what got the most attention was the rollout of the new defense strategy earlier this year, particularly with the decision regarding the 2 BCTs that were scheduled or slated to return to Europe from Afghanistan and Iraq, where they've been deployed for the better part of the last decade. So the Pentagon decided last summer actually to conduct an out-of-cycle strategic review and look at the ways in which it allocates its resources, how it deploys its forces overseas, what its force posture should look like. And it did that for a couple of reasons. One, we were in the middle of winding down the war in Iraq. And two, we were in the early stages of the transition in Afghanistan. And three, the Pentagon was facing unprecedented budgetary constraints. As you all know by now, the Pentagon, because of the Budget Control Act, has had to eliminate close to $500 billion from its budget over the next 10 years. And that set us on a course while I was at DoD working with others to try and step back and carve out a strategic framework for what we called a Joint Force 2020. And there are defense components to this that indicate a rebalancing. In the strategy itself, there are descriptions of our presence in different regions. When it comes to Asia, it talks about enhancing our presence in Asia. When it comes to the Middle East, which is often the forgotten part of the new strategy, it talks about maintaining and adapting our presence in the Middle East. And when it comes to Europe, it uses the word evolving. And again, the focus has been heavily on the BCTs and the fact that they will not be returning to Europe, but in fact they'll be removed from the force along with 6 other BCTs in the United States. I think sometimes that's forgotten. And they're not going to Asia, by the way, as some have been led to believe. But we are enhancing our presence in Asia. We are going to be shifting the emphasis. We now have a marine deployment in Australia. By 2020, we have plans to have 60% of our naval assets stationed in the Pacific. Right now, that number is at 50%. And we have a new forward stationing policy underway in Guam. But for Europe, it's not just about the BCTs. It's really puts and takes, as some of my former colleagues describe it. In the takes category, obviously, again, the BCTs fall there. But in the puts, there was, Sandy Vershbow mentioned this earlier, our aviation detachment in Poland, the investments we're making in missile defense, the new special forces cooperation and enhancement in Europe, and then the rotational presence that will kick off around 2013, 2014. So in terms of what all of this means for Europe, our work diplomatically, economically, and in the defense arena, I would hate for anyone here to conclude that we now have a policy of leaving Europe to Europeans or going alone in Asia. That's not been the approach at all, even from the early days of 2009. We will continue to work very closely with Europe every single day on a number of European challenges, on a number of global challenges. I have the pleasure, sometimes not so much pleasure, displeasure, of spending a lot of my time these days in this infamous Situation Room. And I can tell you every discussion we have has some European component to it, no matter what we're talking about. And that has reassured me about the value of transatlantic cooperation and how critical that is. The last thing I would say is, I think while America has direct interests and reasons for focusing on Asia, so does Europe. And that's why, as Craig noted, there have been efforts over multiple administrations to engage Europeans in Asia dialogues. Kurt Campbell, the Assistant Secretary for Asia, has really ramped up. He's started a wonderful program where he's done lunches all across European embassies all over Washington. He's traveled to Brussels. There was just an EU-US dialogue on Asia earlier in January of this year. And so there's a lot more work we can do. I think the trap is to assume that Europe's interests will remain solely in the economic sphere. I think, as Kurt has pointed out, there's a lot more we can do in the diplomatic and political sphere as well. We don't have to bring the military angle into it necessarily, but I think there's plenty more to discuss. I think this isn't going to go away as a regional focus for all of us, and certainly I can speak for the administration in the fact that we're all looking forward to enhanced engagement with Europe on these challenges in Asia. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Simone, what do you see as the future for this evolving presence and evolving relationship with Europe under these changed circumstances?
Well, I'll build up on what Julie just said and what Sandy had said before and respond to your two questions with a double positive, yes and yes. There is a significant future ahead for the transatlantic partnership on the one hand, and yes, we should do more globally on the other. Having said that, I should quit and would have been particularly eloquent in making my statement, but I gather that I should use 6, 7, 8 minutes to say something else. And today the Riga test, really, now that we woke up from our nightmares last night, is to wonder how we're going to discuss once again the pivot issue. Because there's really very little to say about it. So let me try to do that by starting with a 2-minute statement statement on my sense of the moment, and then following up with 4 propositions pertaining to the future, some of which might sound banal, but ought to be restated nonetheless. With regard to my sense of the moment, I remember a 20th century that was short. It started late and badly, and got worse and nearly suicidal. Then at some point, halfway during the century, in the late 40s, it astonishingly took a turn for the better. In some fashion, over the next several years, Germany was tamed, Russia got brought back to size, and America was brought back into Europe. And this investment of American power and leadership and indeed European vision helped recast Europe and transform the old Westphalian state system into a union of states. The third territorial revolution on the European continent in half a millennium, from city-states to nation-states to member states. And that is just a remarkable achievement that took place as well in the context of a Euro-Atlantic setting, regrouping by the end of this process now 34 states that by and large have overlapping interests, compatible values, common goals, and the potential for complementary capabilities. And I think that this is the point of departure. It is not the talk about a decline of the West, the ascendancy of the West, and the neglect which each side may have for the other, or even whether we are in fact discussing the right issues. We have witnessed during the shortened second half of the 20th century, up to 1991, a radical geopolitical transformation of which historians will be in awe in the future. And when Julie referred to the rediscovery of Riga after a number of years, that is part of the awesome nature of what has taken place. This is what the former Latvian president was really trying to evoke last night. And that's my point of departure. And having said that, then, if I have a couple of minutes, I'll make my 4 propositions. First proposition, the Euro-Atlantic structure that has developed of late, including the EU and NATO, is in fact pivotal to the sense of order in the 21st century, and especially for the first decade. It is pivotal from the standpoint of the states that belong to that architecture, and it is pivotal for the balance of the world as well. The fact of the matter is that the 3 re-emerging states, China, India, and Russia, as well as the new influentials, Brazil, Turkey, the nuisance states, Iran, and so forth, are more interested in the West than in each other. And that, in fact, reflects the reality of that real pivot. Second, there cannot be a reorganization of that basic architecture in the sense of equality and in the sense of global involvement without the EU moving on with its journey. If, in fact, the European Union were not to be able to finish the remarkable revolution that it started over 50 years ago, then it could not become an equal or compatible or even reliable interlocutor in the United States, because one at a time the states of Europe are too small. Third, Barack Obama is a great basketball player, I'm told, and the position he likes to play is point guard, and a point guard needs to pass the ball to a pivot, to a center that is strong and bulky. He's not going to draft in China. He's going to draft in Europe. because that's where in Latvia, the Baltic states, and elsewhere we find now in the NBA the good basketball players. So the pivot issue is totally oversold, and this has been covered well. But I would like to at least introduce the issue, namely, just as we are overstating the weaknesses of the West, we are overstating the ascendancy of the West. Who will be the loser of the 2010s and the 2020s, the way Japan proved to be the loser of the past 20 years? History does not share all of its options with us, and history today stutters. And I'm not convinced that an audit of Chinese weaknesses, of Indian weaknesses, of Russian weaknesses, would produce by the year 2020 what we're saying in 2012. And finally, fourth proposition, and I'll stop here, Mr. Chairman, is the fact that what Mrs. Clinton said as well in that same speech in which she referred to the pivot was that the future will be decided in Asia. I beg to differ. The future today is going to be decided in the greater Middle East. And I'm not extending the future beyond 2020, the deadline of NATO after Chicago. Remember, the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century were decided on the basis of the bands that took place in 1711, 1715, 1812, 1818, and 1913, 1919. The second decade proved to be decisive. I'm satisfied that we're going to meet the test of relevance of the U.S.-European relationship, as well as its pivotal condition in the world order of the 21st century over the next few years, and the test will be met in the Middle East, and this is where, indeed, that we should rely on this magnificent architecture that has been put together, because the Middle East is not going to be resolved by anybody else but by the West, without and in spite of the West. Thank you.
Ambassador Volker, can you be a little, I mean, we've had two kind of very upbeat, optimistic views of this relationship. Can't you be a little dark and gloomy? Just a little bit.
I can be a little gloomy, but start with a couple of things. First off, I want to comment on Julian's point about Groundhog Day. 1 year ago, I was sitting in this chair and you were sitting in that chair.
Yes.
But by the end of the movie, A Groundhog Day, he had learned how to play jazz piano. So by doing this over and over again, maybe you get something out of it. The point I would say first is the pivot. Forget the pivot. Drop it. It's over. It was a bad choice of words. It didn't mean anything. As soon as grown-ups in the administration got a hold of it, they tore it up. So forget the pivot. Rebalancing, I have to say, is not much better, but I can understand why it drifted to that. But really what we need is a global strategy for a global era. And let me talk a little bit about that. First off, what do we see today? Where are we? Globalization is the most important trend that has affected us over the last couple of decades. It has given rise to new powers. It has challenged our economic competitiveness and our productivity. It has made our domestic politics considerably more difficult. And it has leveled the playing field with non-state actors who are able to do lots and lots of things, many of them not very pleasant. So that's what we're all grappling with. Now, if we're not pivoting, what are we doing? And unfortunately, I would argue that the answer right now is retracting. We're pulling in. We're trying to fix ourselves. Understandable, because our economies are weak, our publics are tired, these wars haven't gone the way we wanted them to go. So there is a retrenchment going on in Europe, in the United States, and in the West generally. I think it's a fact. I think that's where we are. And to make sure it's clear, this is not a political statement about either Europe or the U.S. I can't see either political party in the U.S. doing anything different right now. This is just the trend line that we're on. But let me put out the challenge as to what I think we ought to be doing. I think we still, just as in that golden age that Simon mentioned after World War II, we have a vital interest in the way the world develops, in a way that it preserves and reinforces the values that our societies are based on and the ability of our nations to succeed in the world. To be clear, freedom, democracy, market economy, rule of law, respect for human rights and human dignity. We care about that. Those are our values, and that defines who we are. If that's what we have, then we need to think about, well, what should we be trying to achieve in the world to make sure that the world we're going to live in 20 years from now is good for societies like ours? At the moment, we're not setting those goals. In fact, I would argue that what we're doing is we're trying to keep problems at arm's length, manage them as best we can, pull back from being overextended. And that's, as I said, quite understandable. But the problem with that is if we're not setting goals and an agenda and trying to shape the world we're going to live in, plenty of other people are prepared to do that for us. Whether it is rising powers, or whether it is Islamist extremists in the broader Middle East, or whether it is declining powers such as Russia, there are plenty of other actors out there who are prepared to shape that agenda. We should have our own agenda. From that set of goals, you need a strategy about how to go about doing that, perhaps better than the strategies we've had for the past 10 or 20 years, but nonetheless you need a strategy. And I think any strategy for dealing with this trend of globalization and the new challenges that it's presenting requires that the United States and Europe see each other as our best first partners at the beginning. We're the ones who share a common set of values. We are still the biggest economic relationship in the world. We're still the biggest cross-investment. We're still the ones who have the capacity and the will at times to bring economic, political, and security means to bear to a problem. So this relationship does matter, but we need the goals, the strategy, and the leadership behind that to shape the world that we're going to live in. That's frankly what's lacking.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador, you're our European voice here. Are we abandoning Europe?
I don't feel isolated. I think there was a lot of good common European sense on this panel so far.
Good.
And I would like to pick up where Kurt finished, which is grand strategy. This is something we have to approach with a broad mind. It is not just military strategy, and that's how you phrased it. My question is the following one. Is there a conflict between our moral aspirations and strategic realities? I'll give you an example. Why was the Arab Spring presented in our public as a democratic awakening? Try to think about it. Why was it presented as the best way to achieve stability and prosperity in the region and beyond? Second question I'm asking, why do we believe, on what basis do we justify the proposition that more democracy in China will make China, will allow China to best solve the internal problems the country faces? Why do we tell our publics that the West would have no problems or conflicts with a democratic China? So I would say, as far as the United States is concerned, I'm not aware of any debate of these questions. Neither of the candidates or their advisors have raised them. In fact, anything of that kind is absent from the campaign, and I don't blame them. It is the economy dummy. In Europe, we talked yesterday about euro crisis, financial problems, and others. There is a similar question of a more philosophical nature. Are we actually in a situation where democracy, as we know it, and the decisions we have to make in a globalized world are in such fundamental contradiction that the system is cracking? Cracking. So these are very, very important questions, and politicians are worrying about them because they want to get re-elected. So when we focus in our debate on military capabilities and the will to use them, I don't say we are wrong, but there is a broader issue in American-European relations. This world, it has been said, is characterized by uncertainty. And when I was a member of the Albright Group, we worked on the new strategic concept. This was the red thread: uncertainty, undefined strategic challenges. It was not the black and white of the Cold War. In this period, I agree with my three colleagues here on the panel. Benign neglect of Europe by the United States would be self-defeating. It would be a strategic mistake. America is definitely the most powerful nation in the world and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Who can challenge the United States globally? But even America needs good partners and allies, and that is us. First address, as you said, absolutely. So this American move to maintain or establish a robust military presence in the Pacific region is, in my mind, in no way a sign of leaving Europe, neglecting Europe, or anything. The Americans may be different than the Europeans, but I think they know how well to define their own interests. The shift of power is happening, and it seems to me that some people, in trying to make sense of it, go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, when there was an emerging power in the center of Europe, Germany. And so they say, well, probably the Chinese will be as stupid as the Germans then were. We need to talk to them a lot. And we need to listen to them and to study what actually is moving them. The generational change makes it difficult to answer this question. In this world of uncertainty, the transatlantic relationship and NATO are cornerstones of stability, and there are not many in this world. So this is not creating a world of confrontation. It is just good housekeeping to keep this alliance in order. Will we be able to do so? Depends on two things: whether the Americans are able to bring their house in order. It was said yesterday they are operating so successfully because they have federal institutions. Can I just add a footnote to this very optimistic observation? In the last 2 years, the American political system has miserably failed to address key questions. And I'm wondering whether in the period between the presidential election and January the 2nd, they will be able to make appropriate decisions. If not, the defense budget will lose another $500 billion, and the system, the ideas for the Pacific reinforcements, I think, will have to be postponed. So the second thing is, will the Europeans bring their house in order? So it is in our hands. Are we desperate? No. In the Cold War, the great power competition was mainly played out at Olympic Games. It was the medal count. Now, I hope the Brits are not offended if I say that if you count the EU members' medals collectively, ex pluribus unum, like NATO says, we are number one in the world. That gives me hope.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to questions now. Before we do, I just want to remind you, we've got the Young Diplomacy Professionals Forum participants who are watching and will be sending in their questions up here. We hope to have a pretty provocative discussion here. I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question now. Everybody's been pretty optimistic about why this should be maintained, how to work together, especially in terms of Asia. When I go to Asia and meet with traditional American allies there, Korea, Japan, or some new ones like India, and you say, gee, what would you think, US, Europe working more closely together on the challenges of this region? They kind of look down at the floor, they pause, and they say, well, what is it that the Europeans add? They're not really a military presence here in the same way. They're economic, but they're driven so much by just the economic concerns. And the bigger concern is, my gosh, if you start trying to coordinate Asia policy with Europe, you'll never get anything done. For better or for worse, there is this image that working with Europe is just procedurally complicated. So how do we overcome both the perception that Europe doesn't have much to add in the Asia sphere, but secondly, that they'd actually hold the United States back from being an assertive ally to these countries? Kurt, you want to start?
Sure. I think, first off, in terms of those factors that you put on questions, actually, I think they're all true. Those are all things to take into account. And someone earlier mentioned Bob Gates' speech as he was leaving as Secretary of Defense, lamenting that it's hard to maintain an alliance when the capacities on the European side of that alliance continue to decline. So where is Europe? So there is an element to which this retrenchment that I referred to, where we focus on fixing our domestic finances and economies and structures, is important. We have to do that in order to create the capacities to be able to do things. And secondly, yes, it is procedurally difficult to work with Europe, and I don't think it's going to get any easier. That being said, it's a question of, well, what are your other options? The other options are, the U.S. do it on its own? Is that helpful? Or to have Europe off the playing field, and is that really in the U.S. interest? So as complicated and difficult and lacking capacities as they are, it's still the best option going.
Wow. Julie?
It's funny, I've had Europeans ask me the exact same question. Why should we join you in your new excursion towards Asia and your new focus towards Asia? What will we bring? And I think you can do one of two things. You can kind of overestimate what a transatlantic cooperative effort in Asia could produce. I think you can underestimate it by focusing very narrowly on the economic side of the coin. I think there's a lot of middle ground there. Just this last July, Secretary Clinton and Lady Ashton walked out to a podium together at the last ASEAN Regional Forum, and they created a list of areas where they thought they could work together. And it's limited. It is not necessarily sending ships into the South China Sea. There are limits on what we can do together. And I think we can take the defense and military piece and tuck it aside, except in a few areas. Let's take counter-piracy or training we could do for humanitarian assistance or natural disasters. There are actually some very important skill sets that Europeans could bring to bear in that category, but limited. But in the diplomatic area and in that channel, I mean, the work we could do together on poverty eradication, transnational crimes, the list, it's such a rich agenda, actually. And Europe happens to bring a huge wealth of knowledge in managing massive transformative moments in history. Look at what the EU has accomplished in Central and Eastern Europe. It is apples and oranges in terms of what's happening over in Asia, but there are certain lessons that can be extracted in terms of good governance, code of conduct. The list could go on and on. So I think we have to be realistic, and you raise a good point. Let's not, run for the exits and all depart tomorrow for a destination in Southeast Asia or in China. But let's try and carve out, much like we do in our dialogue with the Chinese, some very pragmatic and constructive areas where we could work together.
Thank you. Ambassador?
I agree. The world is not defined by conflict. Conflict is at the end of an unfortunate and politically regrettable development. So conflict of interest in normal life, trade, international relations, human rights, all these issues. There is an agenda to be dealt with in the United Nations, in the WTO, on non-proliferation, you name it. And I think the more the US and the Europeans cooperate, and we do cooperate intensely, the more successful we are. So I think the question is not very well informed.
Okay, good.
May I add a word?
Come on, quick, and then we're going to get out of here.
And I'll essentially stand with Julie on the relevance of Europe to Asia without going as far as Lady Ashton suggesting, quote, that America is a strategic partner of Asia and Europe is an economic partner of Asia. The fact is that there has been an intimacy that's been developing, especially between Germany and China, for example, with levels of trade that have increased dramatically over the past few years, levels of investments both ways, with a great deal of influence now, China within Germany. And China does view the EU as a 550 million people market with a very widespread consumers in there. I mean, the per capita income within the EU evolves from $7,000 plus to $45,000 plus. That's a lot of consumers with a lot of demand. So I think that there's plenty of things to find for China into Europe, notwithstanding how difficult it is to deal with the EU.
Okay, we're going to do a string of questions up that line here, and then we're going to go back there, and then to Hans, and then in the back row.
Yes. Gül Turan, President of the Turkish Council of the European Movement International, and I'm also a professor of economics. What makes you think, Professor Serfaty, that the West can solve problems of the Middle East, and if so, in spite of itself? And if so, what measures do you think the West can take to solve it? And Ambassador Volker, when you're talking about the values lying behind what I call political modernization and economic modernization, and when I see what countries do with those values, I see that some accept them as they are, and some others let those values pass through the filter of their own personal cultural inheritance, and the outcome is sometimes quite different. And then you've got a third group of countries who totally reject them. Thank you.
Okay. Over here.
I'm Bobo Lowe, an independent scholar. I wanted to follow up Julianne's point, talking about Europe's providing some real support, being a player in Asia-Pacific in the sort of diplomatic arena. My problem with that is that it's been some years since Europe has lost any credibility as a political actor in East Asia, and I would say that's particularly true of China. And in the light of recent developments over the last few years, that Europe's moral credibility in East Asia, frankly, is minimal. I wanted to pick up Hans-Friedrich's point. I wondered whether it's not so much whether a democratic China would be more awkward or more cooperative, but whether the real problem is experience here. Because for 2,000 years, China has not really had a foreign policy as we would understand it. China's conception of a foreign policy is the world coming to China. It's actually the phenomenon of China reaching out to the world, engaging with the outside world, is actually very much a post-Mao, in fact, maybe even a post-Tiananmen phenomenon. So I was just wondering whether you thought that as Chinese foreign policy became more experienced, became more mature, do you think that they will be more cooperative, or do you think that they will be more cussed and awkward? And finally, on Simon's point, I'm curious, I see where you're coming from about how non-Western nations regard relations with the West as more important than relations with each other. I would agree with that. But I am curious why you think the greater Middle East is the pivotal theatre as we look ahead, rather than East Asia, because I can imagine some apocalyptic, near-apocalyptic scenarios in East Asia. So I was wondering whether you could expand on that.
Great. Hans? And then all the way
Hans Benedijk. I wanted to unpack the strategy a little bit more as I see it. And I would suggest that it has three parts to it. The first part has to do with Asia and rebalancing. And I'm not sure how much of a role European allies will be able to play in that strategy. Some, as Julian said, but can't forget we have some very strong, capable Asian allies to work with us in that strategy. The second part of this strategy, as I see it, is about Europe. It's about Article 5. It's about reassurance. When we were working with the Albright Group, reassurance in Article 5 was a key issue, and I think the strategic concept as it came out reinforced that, as has a number of other things, as Ambassador Vershbow said this morning. So I don't worry about that part of the strategy either. I worry about the third part of the strategy the most, and this is where Simone was going. The United States some of our capabilities are stretched out, as Julian said. So we are looking to Europe to continue to help us in the third part of the strategy, which is the greater Middle East. And yet, there is sort of an exhaustion here post-Afghanistan. So my real question is, in that third part of the strategy, as we look to Europe to continue to help us in the greater Middle East, will Europe be there? And to what degree?
Great. Final question, way in the back there.
Emilio Lamo from the Elcano Royal Institute, Madrid. Nobody has mentioned here demographic trends and data, and I think that they can be very crucial to be considered. Just to offer you a very simple one. In 1950, which is past week, so to say, at least in historical terms, Europe was about a quarter of the world population, 23-25%. Right now is less than 10%, probably 8%, and it's going to be about 6%. In the same trend, then North America is another 6%, and South America another 6%. Asia is 60%. So we have 10 Asians for each European and for each Americans. What that means is very simple. It means that the relations between Europe and Asia and between North America and Asia are unavoidably increasing. And to that extent, relations between Europe and America are unavoidably suffering a lot of strain. That's, in my opinion, one of the main reasons why we have to strengthen transatlantic relations. But the tension is unavoidable, is there, and is going to continue because the world is again moving from 6,000 million persons to 9,000 million persons. And all that growth is going to take place outside of Europe and outside of the United States. Thank you very much.
Okay, where do you want to start? And yes, Mr. Lowe, they want you to ask more questions. Greater Middle East, why don't we start with that? There were two questions around.
Look, I'm fully aware of the tensions that exist within Asia, where you find a nuclear pas de quatre, which includes two states armed with nuclear weapons, which have relatively unstable, to say the least, regimes, and several of those four states have historical enmities amongst each other. Notwithstanding the question marks raised by Pakistan in the context of unfolding developments in Afghanistan for 2013, when the presidential election is scheduled to be held, I still view the Greater Middle East as the more urgent, more immediate regional problem as reflective of its status as the global Balkans, if you will, of the 21st century, the earlier part of the 21st century. Craig thought that I was optimistic. Not at all. I think that we are at the early phase of the Sarajevo moment, comparable not in its outcome, but in its intensity to the conditions that prevailed in the early 1910s, when each small conflict in the Balkans set the stage for the conflict that followed until they all merged into a global confrontation. There in the Middle East is the place where time is running out of time, when the short term prevails, and where therefore we need to focus our efforts. And Sandy Firth-Barrow, obviously, and others reminded us that NATO is not oblivious to this. This is not the first time that any such statement is made. But whatever issue in the Middle East you look at, whatever issue, imagine the status quo over the next 2 years. That, to me, is a challenge to imagination. It will get much better or much worse, but it will not remain the same. Now, I bring in, if that's being optimistic, then I stand corrected. But that brings me to your question. I spoke of the West as the Euro-Atlantic West, a combination of 34 states, including Turkey, incidentally. And I would like, certainly, more consultation and coordination amongst all 34 states, not only on that region, but everywhere else. And I think that the addition of Turkey would help a great deal. I don't believe that whatever this Euro-Atlantic West does is good for the West. But I do believe that whenever things go bad for that Euro-Atlantic West, it goes bad for the West as well. And if not, that group of 34 states plus converts is not going to take the lead on the Middle East, let me ask you, who will? Who will? And if not now, when? If not now, when? There are lots of things that I wish had been done over the past 18 months. We're too late, but we are hopefully preparing for the next steps now, and it's not for me to answer that question.
Ambassador, do you want to tackle the China question? About whether it was an issue of is the threat that democracy might produce bad decisions, or is it that we really don't have a strong enough understanding? Yeah.
Want me to go?
Yeah.
Well, let's take Bobolu's question, will China with more experience be more cooperative?
Yeah.
I'm not an old China hand, but it seems to me that the generational change in China will produce, in the larger sense, a more assertive attitude towards the world, without giving up the Chinese tradition of considering the country as the middle of the world, and not having, by definition, a policy of territorial expansion, but rather to have respectful neighbors and powers further apart who respect the special Chinese way of doing their things. There seem to be two trends in, and will democracy, if it prevails in China, change that? I think there will always be a struggle between different strains of thinking. So let's take another example, Russia. I've lived in Russia for 3 years and visited many, many times. It's a wonderful country with a wonderful culture, but I detect that deep down in the Russian soul, there are dark forces. I'm profoundly worried by the case of religious something in Kazan. Very, very dangerous, because it's a country with many nationalities. And why are politicians playing in campaigns with a nationalistic element and using the United States as a good example of an unfriendly and untrustworthy big power? So you could easily, I think, get a majority for things in Russia which we don't like. But don't misunderstand me. I'm not opposing democracy in Russia. But I just raised the question that there may be contradictions which are difficult to handle. On the point of demography, it is definitely very important. China, I think they now account for, 25% of the global population? And how much arable land do they have in global terms? 6%. And water, just above 10%. So let us think about demography. These are really very, very, very important issues. On the Middle East, can we help the United States, the Europeans? Well, I have to say, if Central America is the backyard of the United States, so is the Middle East for us. And so I always considered the Middle East, or let's say the Mediterranean part of the Middle East, as a primary responsibility of the European Union. In 1980, we tried the first time our hand on the Palestinian conflict. The European Council in Venice proposed to go for a Palestinian state solution. That caused a major conflict between Europe and the United States. Today, it is common policy. In the early 90s, when we developed in the European Union the policy of preventive crisis management, which was called enlargement of the European Union to the east, we were aware that we needed a complementary policy towards the Mediterranean, which was everything we are doing for Eastern Europe minus membership. Unfortunately, and there was money available also, unfortunately, I have to say that the patient was not very receptive for the medicine we proposed. So what I'm trying to say is it is a very difficult mix of problems we are facing there. But having been moderately unsuccessful, we have to try again, and I think with joint forces.
And what would that mean? What would it mean for the United States and Europe to really join forces to address those issues? What would it look like?
I'll give you a good example. We were negotiating, European Union was negotiating a free trade agreement with Morocco. It almost failed. Why? Because the European Union refused to give a quota for 1,000 tons of flour import. It boils down to very real things. So market opening, education, it is a policy over the long haul, investment, all that stabilizes an economy with a big, young, educated generation without perspective of jobs and opportunities.
Clear, Kurt, any comments on this, or should I go back? Kurt?
I would,
Quick.
because I have a somewhat different view on the Middle East as we discussed it here. First off, I think it's primarily about the people in the region. I don't think of it as Europe's backyard or America's playground. It's about the Middle East and the people that live there. And they have, for the first time since the end of colonialism, had the opportunity to really stand up and demand rights, freedom, justice in their society. And what we've seen is that lots of people are trying to exploit that. Extremists, Islamist extremists on one side, the old regimes on the other. During this period in the 80s and 90s, we, not Europe alone, the United States too, guilty of working principally with the dictatorships that were there and not demanding reforms and change and justice in society. And now that the people there are doing it, we're largely standing aside. Libya was a good example where we did intervene and it helped the people of Libya get control of their country. Unfortunately, I think since then we haven't done enough to continue to try to provide support and development, particularly in security services, but all across the board in Libya. And in the rest of the broader Middle East, it's time we brought up Syria in the discussion. I think it is horrible to see what we've seen in Syria, and I think all of us feel that we just can't deal with this. Which is a shame because lots of other people are dealing with it, whether it is Sunni extremists or whether it is Iran or other powers there. And that's when you ask the question, what would U.S. and European engagement together look like? It would be trying to put our efforts on the scale behind the people who are trying to bring about change in line with the same values that we share. And to the very specific question that was asked by the woman from Turkey, cultural differences in the application of democracy, of course, we all do that, and even within the United States, among different states, or within Europe or Japan. But rejection of democracy, I don't know that people reject democracy. Small groups of people who want to impose their views on others reject it because they want to maintain power.
Okay. Let's go over here. There was a question right here, I believe. We got a mic over there, and others over in this area. Yep. Okay. Right up here. Here. There we go. You can just throw it. There we go.
Continuing on the Middle East and the issue of values and what Simon said that the future could be determined there. The upheavals in North Africa are based on a number of factors: economic, social, cultural, political. But underlying all of them is religion. Religion is obviously a social and cultural factor, but it's also becoming increasingly political and even economical. And given what's happening to U.S. embassies right now throughout this region, are we facing a clash of values? Here in the West, we believe in freedom of speech. In this region, they believe that speech needs to be restricted, especially when it covers sacred subjects. Can we ever reconcile this? And as the EU and NATO seeks to work with these regions in social ways, are we ever going to overcome this major difference?
Okay, there was another question right back there.
Thank you. My name is Ala Olim. I work at the European External Action Service in Brussels. I'd like to thank, first of all, Simon for bringing up the Middle East as the pivotal region. I think it's certainly, from a European perspective, the case. And it's not just because it's geographically close to us. I agree also with Kurt that it's probably improper to call it our backyard or our playground. And I also thank Kurt for bringing up the point of the people of the Middle East being now the subject of history and really changing the game in the region. I'd like to hark back to what was said earlier by Ambassador Plutz about the possible conflict between values and interests. And you mentioned the Middle East being one area also. Perhaps you could expand on this, what you meant by that. I heard some regret here from Ambassador Volker that in the past both Europeans and Americans had perhaps been too cozy to authoritarian regimes in this area. Should now the difficulties we face with the democratization, the democratic transitions, mean that we should turn our back, or should we regret having welcomed and supported this? Or should we, on the other hand, do more to support the democratic transition and to ensure that they will go in the right direction?
Okay. So why don't we take these two on the Middle East? And I guess what I'd like to do is start the proposition seems to be that the Middle East is a much better place for U.S.-European cooperation than any other place. Do the four of you agree with that? You do, I know. Or you think it's central. Julie, I mean, what's your perspective on that?
I think we have a pretty rich history already of cooperating on a number of challenges that are brewing in the Middle East. I mean, you can look at today's long list of challenges in the region and see deep EU or European American cooperation, whether it's trying to halt Iran's nuclear ambitions, whether it's dealing with Syria and the humanitarian crisis that seems to be unfolding as a result, Israeli-Palestinian, the Sinai, obviously Libya, the list goes on and on. We've used all the collective tools in our toolbox. Each of us have very different sets of relationships with these countries, and in some cases it's better for one side of the Atlantic to be a little more vocal and outspoken than the other side, depending on the issue at hand and the tools that we feel are necessary to address the challenges. But one thing that's going to be increasingly critical as we address the challenges in the Middle East is identifying and working with and developing even deeper partnerships. Partnerships are going to be more and more critical as we move forward in all categories, not just in the defense category, but particularly in regards to defense because of this age of fiscal austerity that is leading to a decline in real capabilities in the NATO alliance. You could just look at Libya as an example. Look at the role that a country like Sweden played or the other Arab nations that joined that mission. Absolutely critical. So even stepping, again, leaving the defense equation off the table in the economic and trade area, in the emerging democracies, in the emerging transitions that aren't even inching their way towards democracies yet, our cooperation will be absolutely critical in this region. It has been for quite some time, but it will continue to need to be robust and real and very, very capable. We'll need to bring the full bear of tools in our collective toolbox. We'll need to bring those to bear in many cases.
Okay. Kurt?
Europe has more capacity in the Middle East than it has in Asia. It has more of a direct interest in the outcomes in the Middle East than it has in Asia. And it has communities in Europe that are immigrants from North Africa that give it a very direct interest as well.
So do you think that the United States and Europe, though, have a common enough view of what needs to get done there? I mean, I'm in part getting back to the comment about how you approach just kind of very different value structures within the region.
Right.
And when you sit down and listen to Americans and Europeans, you sometimes feel that they have a very different approach. Maybe Americans are more assertive about protecting freedom of speech, sometimes, not always. Obviously, Denmark paid a big price for freedom of speech, freedom of press there. But is there really a capacity for the United States and Europe to work in a really close way, and especially given some of the differences, say, around Israel-Palestine?
Right. A couple of thoughts on that. One of them, I think there is more of a common view right now than you give credit to. I think there is a common view. I think it's a disappointing common view in my view of it. But
which is pessimism?
Right. Well, it's that it is the pacifism. It's the sense that we can't do much about this. It's dangerous for us to try to do something about this. And in leaving the people in the region to be pushed and swayed and imposed upon by extremists or by authoritarians or latent military structures, it's probably not going to come out the best way for our own interest or for the people in the region. But that said, I think that both the U.S. and Europe share this degree of caution about how to deal with the Middle East right now. And just because it relates to the question about freedom of speech, let me bring that up too. I think that there's more in common there, again, between the Western model and the North Africans than is implied perhaps by the question that may have even been intentional. Certainly the notion that people would be offended by something that offends their religion or their culture or identity happens everywhere. People go out and protest about that. Good. Let them protest. Happens everywhere. The trigger is, does that turn to violence? Does that turn to burning down embassies or murdering ambassadors. That's a very sharp dividing line, and that's not something where the majority of the people of the Middle East or the majority of Islam is comfortable either. In fact, just this morning, everyone from the Muslim Brotherhood on denouncing this. It is a core group of extremists exploiting a situation, and we have to be very clear-eyed about dealing with that.
Simone?
The consequences of a war in the Middle East would be indivisible. It is not a question of whether the Europeans would be hurt more than the United States or vice versa. Introduce a conflict in the Middle East over the next 6 to 18 months and try to imagine what our previous discussions about putting the Eurozone back on track, for example, would be. I'm not discussing the euro on the basis of economic fundamentals. I'm discussing the Eurozone on the basis of geopolitical fundamentals. And the most urgent geopolitical issue at the moment is what happens there. I'm willing to take a good bet, good odds, on a conflict with and over Iran before the next elections in Iran in June. Okay? And you cannot divide that. To say that Europe took the lead in the Middle East, that is just not correct. The fact of the matter is that the United States handled the Middle East alone and well. For 40 years during the Cold War, kept the oil flowing at a reasonable price for 20 of those years, kept the Soviets out, and kept Israel safe at the cost of $200 billion over those 40 years. We could do this alone. We cannot do it alone now. Europe is involved not because it is a power in the Middle East, but to an extent because it has become a Middle Eastern power. And accordingly must attend to that issue. If the Europeans want to lead, say what you'll do. If they don't, the Americans must lead, but they cannot do it alone. And I keep asking the question, if not with the Europeans, with whom? We do not want to work with Russia and Syria, with China and Sudan.
Okay. Ambassador, did you have a comment? Or were you just nodding in agreement?
That's okay, but I wanted to make a remark of a sort of more general sense. When you get older and you are no longer in office and have to deal with daily crises, you discover that the short-termism of having to react today is the enemy of strategy. And I would make the following point. When the Yugoslav disintegration started with all the conflicts, this issue hijacked all the strategic energy of Europe and beyond for a couple of years, and we neglected Mediterranean and others. I'm sorry to say this is how life is. So when we now talk about the Middle East, we have an interest in a stable means a stable region, which means countries which have a system which is accepted by their population, if not necessarily by us, but by them. And I would like to remind you that in that area, there are not many states which you could call traditional. Not Syria. Iran, yes. Turkey, yes. Well, I don't want to mention to all of them, but we seem to make a mistake in thinking that in this Arab awakening, democracy is the leading issue. I think it is groups which are defined by religion, by this and by that, and tribal, who are asking for power or struggling for power. To give an example of the contradiction between strategic reality and our aspirations, I would say George W. Bush's policy of exporting democracy, even with military means, is such a denial of strategic reality. And on religion and politics, why do I think that the EU relationship with Turkey is beyond anything political and economical so important? Because Turkey is a country with Muslim population. And to bring them into our fold according to their own wishes is a demonstration that Islamic population and democracy and rule of law are not in fundamental contradiction. So there is a message there, and they have to choose the system they want to live in. And to set a good example may be encouraging.
Okay.
I just saw a question about the toolbox and what I meant by that, just to be clear for whoever's twittering away here. What I meant was that the Europeans and the Americans have a collective toolbox of instruments that they've used in the Middle East for many, many years. And you can take some most recent examples. In Iran, we've used two tools primarily. We've used sanctions, which have been some of the toughest that we've ever seen implemented. And we've used negotiations through the P5+1. In other countries, we use development assistance, we use diplomacy, we work with civil societies. In other cases like Libya, we use military force. So that's what I meant when I referenced the toolbox, that from A to Z, the Europeans and Americans, whether it's the EU or NATO and the US, can bring all sorts of instruments to bear when they're tackling challenges. And it doesn't have to apply to the Middle East. Obviously, they can be used elsewhere. But the Middle East is one area where we are using the full spectrum of instruments on a day-to-day basis.
Next round of questions. Right here in the front, and then we'll go to the back, and then over here. Sorry.
Well, about values. I mean, in Latvia and other countries, we have a law against inciting racial hatred and nationalism and all that. Isn't that the same in America? What would happen if a radical Muslim group in America made a film about denigrating Christ? Can you imagine what would happen in Washington too? Number two, what about the Palestinian state? Will we have to wait another 50 years? I mean, this is one tool. Where's the toolbox for that? There's no progress whatsoever, and there never will be, and there'll always be a problem in the Middle East.
Okay. Back there, or actually, why don't you go to the woman over here, and then we'll work our way back. Hold up your hand in the back row there so they can, right there. Okay. Go ahead.
Hello, Mary Dejevsky from the Independent newspaper in London. There was something that Julianne Smith said in her presentation at the beginning, said that the US has no policy of leaving Europe to the Europeans. And I just wonder whether that isn't part of the problem, in the sense that NATO and American dominance in NATO has really given the Europeans a pretext for not spending the amount of money that America would like to see the Europeans spending. And speeches like the one that Robert Gates gave in Brussels don't really help that. Nor does some of what Julianne Smith has been saying about the Europeans maybe helping the way that they could help in the Middle East or in Asia policy. We heard from the previous panel that there was a problem in discussing defence in the European Union because it was discussed by defence ministers, and in the NATO context, it was not really discussed in the European context. Merkel was involved in the Euro discussions, but she wasn't seen to be involved in the defence discussions. And yet the downside of that is that when the Europeans, on the rare occasions they appear to start to get their defence act together, then the Americans start to be very worried about the Europeans acting independently. And I think there's a contradiction there, which does weaken policy.
Okay, back there.
Thank you. Robert Dalshaw, Swedish Defence Research. I agree with the panel that we shouldn't worry about the pivot as such. 2 brigades and an aircraft squadron doesn't make that big a difference because the real firepower of America lies across the horizon. and could be brought to bear, no pun intended, if needed. What we should perhaps worry about are the underlying reasons for the pivot, the potential for conflict between China and its neighbors, many of which are allies with the United States, and where the U.S. acts as a guarantor of the status quo, with nationalism over silly little islands. If it came to shooting war in the waters of China, the pivot that would come after that is perhaps what we should worry about, and also the economic consequences of such a thing. Thank you.
Okay. One more question, and before we get on to the, go back to the panel. Anybody? Oh, right there. Okay, good.
Okay, can I inject a degree of optimism?
No.
I feel there's far too much pessimism here. I think the optimistic story is of the latest iteration of American power. I think one of the problems with a lot of this discussion is there is this sense that the United States is inevitably declining. And one of the points I'd like to make about this is particularly I specialize in energy, and what I would say to you is the United States is not declining. I think you can see the shale gas revolution in the United States providing the latest iteration of American power. You can see on top of that, this issue is about population, which were raised earlier. The United States, I always say the United States' ultimate strategic advantage is that the green card is the trump card, that both native population growth and immigration will ensure, even on current projections, a US of around 400 million by around 2040. And the capacity, the great advantage of the US is GDP per capita on an enormous scale, matched with the scale of population. The US is currently the third largest population in the world after India and China, and it has that massive GDP per capita, and that will be enhanced and strengthened during the course of the 21st century. Now, I think if you look at it in those terms, the real problem for Europe is this. If the Americans get stronger, they move towards 1 billion Americans by 2100 or so, they remain fully the modern Rome in terms of the Pax Americana stretches out into the 22nd century. What is the position for the Europeans? Because are we simply going to become essentially a greater Switzerland? You know, a place where you go on holiday, which produces some very nice goods, and our strategic role is, to say the least, in a world of 8 or 9 billion people with an immensely powerful United States as the dominant power, the predominant power. What exactly is Europe's position? And I think one of the issues here is the overall liberal order remaining in place, but the Europeans being a very small part of that order, and unless they do something quite dramatic to transform themselves, we are going to simply decline into Switzerland. Perhaps you might like to address that.
Okay.
Optimistic, at least.
No, these are good. This is a very optimistic question to end things. Who wants to take, is Europe in inevitable decline and just going to be, and then we'll go back to the other two questions. Ambassador?
Yeah. Well, Switzerland is not such a bad country.
How many of the Europeans here want to be Switzerland? There we go. Okay, we got a couple. See?
When you look at the figures, gross national product per person, public debt, and all that, I've been wondering whether the Eurozone should join Switzerland. On defense in the European dimension, this was off limits for a long time. And I think it was the new strategic concept, which was approved in Lisbon in November 2010, which reflected a fundamentally different US position, which was do what you say you want to do, referring to the Lisbon Treaty, do it fast and do it well. Is Europe delivering? 2 question marks. And an optimist might say, not yet. How would we want to live, and what role would we want to play in the future? in the strategic debate which preceded the new strategic concept, I detected on all fronts something which I would call a new sense of strategic humility. And I think that is something which might be better in line with our budgetary constraints and with populations who don't want to venture far from home than any alternative.
Okay. Julie, I think the question was very directly to you. So
Sure. So you're right. There was a time when the United States had some serious concerns, the back end of the Clinton administration, first few years of the Bush administration, about ESDP, the European Defense Agency, the back and forth over the chocolate summit. We all remember these very tense conversations, and there were very serious U.S. concerns about the impact on NATO and transatlantic defense cooperation. But you really must come back to D.C. sometime soon, or if you can't, you can look up all of the speeches that Sandy Vershbow has given during his time in the Pentagon as Assistant Secretary on matters tied to the EU. I can think of some meetings I sat in between Secretary Gates and Solana that were very telling. I mean, Washington has a completely different view right now on European defense. The number of engagements I had while I was at the Pentagon with Madame Arnaud, who would come by and we would have conversations about smart defense and about how EDA could lash up with, for example, the Chicago summit and the deliverables there. I can't count the number of times that I had very serious working level discussions with EU officials on defense matters. Outside of that, we now have American civilians serving in EU missions overseas, under an EU command, so to speak. So a lot has changed, and I think if you run the halls of the Pentagon and you talk to all the folks who work for Phil Gordon, come over to the White House and sit down with folks, I think there'd be a little bit of shock and awe in witnessing the quite dramatic change. I've seen men and women in uniform in the Pentagon saying how the important thing for the United States is a capable European partner. And if that country finds it's easier to wear an EU patch while they're in uniform and in a mission, that's going to deliver capabilities, great. If it's more useful to have a NATO patch on your arm or your national flag, great too. But we want capable partners. And when I said that we look to work with Europe in the future on Europe, I didn't necessarily mean we want to provide for all of European security in the future. We want a capable Europe. But it is in our direct interest to work with Europeans on Europe, particularly in the Caucasus, and carrying on with that whole and free agenda as we move further eastward. So come see us. Come on over.
Simone?
I dismiss the idea of American decline. I understand fully that there has been a relative adjustment, and as some people have put it, the rise of the West has not come at the expense of the West, at least not yet. So I dismiss that. I refuse to live with the idea of a European decline as well. I just refuse to do that.
Why? I mean, given the numbers that he gave.
Because the bounce back of Europe over the past 60 years, the ability to adapt, to rethink its history, and to reorganize its geography, point to resilience on the part of... And how did they do it? They did not say after each hiccup, we've lost. Each crisis over the past 60 years was a catalyst for a further relaunching of the European institutions. Individual states kept declining and bouncing back, starting with the UK, which bounced back twice, following this ridiculous phase of British history, 1950, 1966, 67, when it fell behind Italy, managed to enter the European common market and bounced back with Thatcher in the 1980s for a superb performance in the 1990s and early 2000. Germany bounced back. It was the sick man of Europe in the mid-1990s, notwithstanding the bounce back from 1950 on. Even the French will learn how to bounce back in the 2010s after having bounced back in the 1960s and the 1970s when they began to build planes instead of selling perfumes. So what is this notion? Europe has come to be so low about itself as to think that its future is that of Switzerland because allegedly some of the European states cannot produce babies anymore. To me, I refuse to live. But if that were to be the case, if that is the fate of Europe because of a shock in the Middle East, which would in fact unravel the whole edifice, or whatever else, because of a shock, then America should look for alternative partners. Because in the 2010s, the 2020s, the 2030s, for the coming of this 21st century, we in America need allies who are not only willing, but who are capable and relevant. And if you guys make your own case for incapability and irrelevance, then so be it. Then I'll revise my initial answer to Craig's opening question and say, no, bye-bye. We've got alternatives. We've got a good potential friend with Turkey. Brazil is doing remarkably well, and God knows is ambitious, has been since the mid-1850s, for God's sake. And we can also pick India, which is emerging as well. Who knows? We'll find other friends elsewhere. But it is in your hands. The reason why I cannot answer some of the policy questions on what to do in the Middle East is because time has run out of time. This is not a time for reflection. This is a time for action.
Kurt, as someone that probably will end up...
I don't know why I'm passionate about it.
I wanted to make sure he wasn't going to have a stroke on us.
No, it's okay. No.
Kurt, at what point would you say, what would have to happen for you to say, okay, the United States and Europe, they're going to be best friends, but they're not necessarily going to be strategic partners? I mean, we've heard a lot of different comments today. I don't think we've heard any European say, yeah, Europe is ready to run right in there and be kind of an equal partner with the United States globally. We've focused a lot on how to work together in the Middle East, but even there, I think the issues around Palestine-Israel, for example, present some pretty big barriers. There is economic decline, although obviously Simone knows something that the energy business doesn't know, that things are going to get better in Europe before they get worse. Are you convinced now? No. At what point...
I can start again.
At what point doesn't it work?
Right. Julie made a point earlier about the toolbox, and I want to reiterate that. There's more than just military power.
Right.
There's political, there's economic, there's psychological, there's suasion. When it comes to commentary, Europe is a superpower. In terms of global opinion.
When it comes to criticism.
In terms of global opinion. Look at BBC, look at France 24. I mean, it's out there. So capacity matters. The values on which we all look at the world and deal with the world matter. And we've got to figure out how best we can work together to try to shape that world. It won't, if it's military and Europe is slashing its defense capacities, there's going to be less there. But in other areas, it still matters that we try to figure out how to work together.
Really?
Really.
Okay.
Can I address other points that were raised? Because there were just a couple. One, we have equal opportunity hate speech in the U.S. It's not only anti-Muslim groups that broadcast. Everybody does everything. It's the nature of our perspective on free speech. And I would say that over the last 30 or 40 years in our society, we've become much more sensitive also about trying to behave better in a society. We call it political correctness or what you will, but we've made a conscious effort as a society to be more respectful. But at the same time, we preserve the basic fundamentals of free speech. And on the point of U.S. decline, I don't think anyone spoke of U.S. decline. I don't see U.S. decline. I don't think you do. What I described was retrenchment as a matter of policy, which has different causes and different reasons. That's not a matter of national decline. And then finally, the final point on the defense budgets I just wanted to come back to, because it's not the case that Europe doesn't invest in defense much because of the United States. It's the case that Europe doesn't invest much in defense because it doesn't want to.
Okay, good. So we're almost at the end. There's been a little, we've got a little delay in terms of lunch. So here's what I'd like to do. I can't say that I feel better at the end of this hour and a half or more optimistic. I know the four of you are optimistic, but I have to say I don't think I am. Who in the audience would kind of sum it up in a very positive way what they heard? I mean, is there someone here that would say this is the beginning of a great new period of cooperation and collaboration between the United States and Europe?
I think it's a very unsuitable question.
Okay.
You don't ask a couple that has been married for 45 or 50 years whether they would go again and do it.
Well, I've only been married 37 years, and my wife does ask that, but over here.
Begos Polis, Latvian MOD. Actually, I don't remember who of the speakers used the comparison of the Olympic Games medal counting, where Europe is absolutely at the top. But speaking about the couple, I would also remind that if you look on the, I don't remember which Chinese university makes this list, but if you look on the world's best universities, amongst the first 10, there are the 9 American, and then depending on a year, it's Cambridge or Oxford. Sometimes some other comes in. But idea is, if we speak about education determines who is on the top of the world. And here, America and Europe are on the top of the world. There is no question about that. Obviously, another question is what is the quality of the students and what kind of students you have in American and European universities. And this is the issue what Tom Friedman is constantly asking in America. And we also in Europe, after the Bologna Declaration, must ask because we can be even better. But there is no question who is on the top and how we work together. Thank you.
So just a side comment on education. There's kind of a market test of where students go. So in the United States, for the first time 2 years ago, there was no European country in the top 10 countries sending students to the United States. It's, I think it's China with 125,000, India with 110,000, Indonesia. As a matter of fact, the largest European country, continental European country, is Germany, and it is below Dubai or UAE, I believe, in terms of number of students. I mean, it's fascinating how there's been a tremendous shift. Is there somebody else here who's really optimistic? Here we go. I'm looking for encouragement.
Certainly, being on the inside of the policy-making machine in Brussels, I can say for a fact that EU-US relations are the best they've ever been. Mm-hmm. And it's not only the current administration. I would say that the second Bush administration already started this trend. In fact, this is being reinforced as I speak. I mean, there are daily, very close consultations between Lady Ashton and Secretary of State Clinton on a whole range of issues. Now, it's a different question whether or not Europe can always deliver and be the capable partner. This is the crucial question, I think. But the will and the understanding that the EU and United States are in the same boat is very clear to all. So I'd just like to confirm what was said also about, the European defense capability being welcomed by the US nowadays. I would also mention here that there are initiatives to bring us closer together also in the economic field. It was Chancellor Merkel who came out with the idea of having a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement between the United States and Europe. And there are huge gains to be made economically Absolutely. There, but there are also, I would argue, correlations with the political field and even the defense field that could flow out of that eventually. So I think there are great reasons for optimism.
Okay. One last optimist right here. Is there anybody over on this side?
Yeah.
Is there anybody that's really negative?
Okay. On optimism, I think just a reminder of the country we are in right now. 30 years ago, this country and our neighbors are given up for dead. And if we would have had a conference like this in 1980, anywhere in the world, and talked about the Baltic states restoring independence, the Berlin Wall coming down, I don't think you'd find many who are optimistic about it. So I think miracles can happen, and the mere fact that we are having this meeting here is an indication that I think Simon's optimism that we can recover from anything is worth defending and supporting.
Okay. Any final comments? Nope?
Very good.
Okay. Right over here.
Let me just say.
No, hold on 1 second.
Optimism is, there's no such a thing today as optimism. That's complacency, but you can have constructive pessimism, because the most interesting, stimulating, constructive initiatives usually take place for the mieux, for lack of an alternative.
Okay, final comment.
Fundamentally, we have shared values. The more these values spread around the world, the less conflict, the more potential for trade and prosperity, very fundamentally.
Okay, good. Join me in thanking the panel, and we started out talking about pivots and tilts. We ended up coming down to really the fundamental questions of the future of this relationship. And actually, maybe I am a bit more optimistic than I was at the beginning, a bit more. Constructive pessimism, I think that's what it is. There's going to be volunteers outside that will steer you to lunch. And then we'll be coming back here in the afternoon to talk about Russia, which should be pretty good. Thank you.